Okay, so welcome to the lecture today, where we're going to be talking about the concept of hostage and crisis negotiation. In terms of an overview, I've tried to break it down into quite simplistic sections. So we're going to be looking at, to start with, who are negotiators and how do you become one. It might be that there are some people in the room who think that they might want to go on to become hostage and crisis negotiators. So hopefully this will give you some insight into what you need to do if you want to go on to that type of career. And I think some of the information might surprise you in relation to that. Secondly, we're going to look at what do negotiators do. Thirdly, we're going to look at why do you negotiate in these type of situations. And then lastly, we're going to move on to look at how you negotiate. Now, what I will say is that today we're going to be touching upon that fourth one, but when we have the next lecture, which isn't next week but the week after, that's when we'll be really getting into the nitty-gritty of how you negotiate in these type of situations. So before we start, it's helpful to have some sort of understanding of the key terms that you might hear me using. Okay, so to begin with, you'll hear me referring to the concept of a subject. Okay, now that can refer to two different types of people. Okay, it could refer to a hostage taker, or it could refer to somebody who is considered to be an individual in crisis. Okay, so it covers both of those two eventualities. And you'll see as we go through that not all of the work that negotiators do relates to hostage taking. Okay. Secondly, a hostage. Okay, so when we talk about the true definition of a hostage, what we're talking about is someone who's actually been seized or held as security for the fulfillment of a condition. Now, normally that involves somebody taking someone hostage to fulfill some sort of instrumental demand. Okay, it normally relates to money, it's normally financial, but it's not always. Okay, so you will have seen in the films where people sort of say, I want you to pay X amount of money in ransom for me to release the hostage. Okay, so that's the true definition of a hostage. However, what you will find is that I will refer to the term victim as well. Okay, now because not a lot of what negotiators do involves what we would consider to be true hostages, a lot of what they will be doing involves victims instead. Okay, now a victim is someone who is essentially prevented from leaving a premises. Okay, so it might be that it's an interpersonal violence that is escalated between two individuals, and that one person then prevents the other person from leaving the house or flat or whatever it might be. So in that instance, it's more likely to be an escalation of conflict rather than somebody actually being taken hostage. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah, so you'll hear me talking about hostages and victims. It's important that you understand the difference. Okay, so who are negotiators? Well, some of you will remember, if you were here when I did that little quiz in the first session, that I gave you a little bit of tidbit about this, okay? Essentially, hostage and crisis negotiators, both in the UK and the US, are police officers, okay? You have to be a serving police officer in either of those countries to work as a hostage or crisis negotiator. Okay, now every UK police force has a team or a cadre of negotiators, and that will vary in size depending on how big the geographical area is that force covers, whether it's metropolitan or rural. Okay, it makes common sense that there will be more of these type of incidents happening in metropolitan areas, in big city areas, than we see in the rural areas. Okay. In order to go on to become a negotiator, obviously you have to be a police officer with operational experience, okay, and that's somewhat ambiguous in terms of how much experience you need to have, but the way they differentiate between enough experience or not is stipulating that you have to be of a certain rank before you can apply to become a negotiator. Okay, so in most forces, at the moment it is sergeant rank or above. But in some forces, so like the Met and Greater Manchester Police, so the bigger city-based forces, it's actually inspector level or above. Okay, and that's how they sort of determine that you've got enough operational experience to go on to become a negotiator. Now you'll see up here that there are some little asterisks, and that's because this is changing. Okay, there are changes afoot in that they are looking at widening the eligibility for people to become negotiators. And they are actually trialling in some forces, they're trialling taking on police staff or police civilians rather than police officers. And it's still very much in its infancy, and we don't know whether that's going to continue or be rolled out nationally, but it is happening that they are looking at widening the eligibility, which is quite good. And again, they are in some forces starting to lower the rank requirement, because there are some very experienced police constables, for example, who would make great negotiators, and you're sort of precluding some really good negotiators by saying they've got to be sergeant rank or above. So watch this space. Now, the other bit is that your current police role, okay, mustn't conflict with the concept of being a negotiator. Now, as I said to you before, negotiators are actually volunteers. So all of these people that work as negotiators will be doing this as an add-on to their day job. Okay, they will have a police role, a day job that they do day in, day out, and they will take this role on top of that. Okay, and they'll be on call for a period of normally 1 week in every 6 or 1 week in every 5, and that's for a 7-day period, 24 hours a day. Okay, so they'll be on call from 7 a.m. Monday morning to 7 a.m. the next Monday morning. But the key thing is that if you are, for example, a firearms officer, it becomes somewhat of a conflict of interest for you to be holding a gun, towards somebody if you're trying to actually negotiate them out of that situation. So firearms officers can't be negotiators. Okay. Same thing applies somewhat with dog handlers. Okay, I do know somebody who was a dog handler and a negotiator, but those two things again don't really go together. So you've got to make sure that your current role isn't going to conflict with the principles of negotiation. You've got to be able to demonstrate key competencies, which again, when you're going for any type of role, all of these seem to be quite commonsensical when you are trying to actually talk somebody out of a situation. You need to have good communication skills, you need to have good active listening skills, and what you'll find as we go through the lectures is that negotiators do a lot more listening than they do talking. Okay, bizarrely enough. You think about a negotiator being the person, the mouthpiece, the person who's doing the talking, but actually a lot of negotiation is about listening. Okay. Team working ability. You'll see as we go through that actually negotiation is not an isolated activity. It's something that you have to do as a team, and you have to be able to work as a team. Okay. And lastly, I've put up there about the fact that there's a lack of financial remuneration for most forces, and that is the case. These people don't do it for extra money, okay, because most of them don't get paid any additional money for doing it. They do it because they want to actually save lives, and that's more important to them as a police officer than the money. So how do you become a negotiator? Well, it's fairly straightforward when you think about applying for a job or a role. There's an application form that you fill out, okay, which will require you to demonstrate how you meet certain key competencies, like the ones we've just talked about. If you get through that first sift or paper sift, you then have to go into a practical role-play based assessment, okay, where essentially you'll be asked to go into a room, there'll be a telephone on the room, you'll have to answer the telephone when it rings, and you have to use your instinct to try and talk the person on the other end of the phone out of the situation that they're in. Now, most of the time for these type of assessments, it will be something like somebody who is feeling suicidal, who is saying that they're going to take their own life, or it might be some sort of domestic barricade situation, okay? But it's not going to be a hostage-taking situation at that stage. And it's about just assessing your natural instinct and how you would respond in that type of situation if you were encountered with it in real life. During that assessment, you'll actually be assessed by people who are quite experienced negotiators, okay, and they have sort of crib sheets that they'll use to mark how well people perform on the assessment. And the person on the other end of the phone, guess who they are? A negotiator. Okay, so it's somebody who, normally from another force potentially, who knows what they're doing, who's basically playing the role of being an individual in crisis or a hostage taker. Okay, So they'll be the one that you're talking to on the other end of the phone. So that's the first step. So if you're successful at that point, you don't then obviously become a negotiator. You're getting through the first stage to be able to be eligible to be trained as a negotiator. Okay, so if you're successful in that bit, in the application process, you will then go on to complete a number of different training courses. So the first one is a regional training course, which is normally 1 week long, incredibly intensive. You're working 14 hours a day typically. They'll come and wake you up in the middle of the night to see whether you can cope with the pressure of getting up and actually functioning at 2 o'clock in the morning without not much sleep. And the focus for that course will be very much on crisis negotiation. Okay, so like I said, with the scenario, they're not going to throw you in at the deep end and expect you to be able to negotiate in a hostage-taking situation. The focus is very much on crisis negotiation. Now, some people stop at that level, and they don't necessarily go on to be trained at a national level or any further, but most people go on to complete the national training course, which is a 2-week course run out of Hendon, so the Metropolitan Police's training centre. And again, the same thing applies, 14-hour days, incredibly intensive. The incrementality of the sort of situations increases as you go through that 2 weeks, and the focus will be very much on negotiating in hostage-taking situations. So it goes from dealing with sort of singular hostage-taking scenarios where it might be that one person has been taken hostage in a particular stronghold, and you're then trying to negotiate the release of that person, all the way towards at the end of the 2 weeks they run a large-scale operation with a hijacking at Heathrow Airport, and they actually have a plane that they hijack, and they have firearms and everything else there, so it's a massive operation. So they try to make it as realistic as possible to see how you're going to cope, and to see whether you can actually deal with these type of situations, but also so that when you come out of the training, they sort of say that if you can cope with the training, you can cope with anything on the outside, okay, because the training is that intense. I've put up there about Red Centre training as well. Now, Red Centre training is another course that you can go on once you've completed your national training course and you are considered to be experienced enough to go on to do that. Red Centre is the terminology that the police use for a kidnap case, okay, so an actual kidnap and extortion case. And the type of negotiation that's involved in that type of scenario is very different to any other. So if you have somebody who is taken hostage and is kidnapped, what will often happen is the police have to make sure that nobody knows that they're actually involved. Okay, so a family member might be told, they might be phoned or texted or something saying that their spouse or their daughter or whoever it might be has been taken hostage, and that they have to pay they want you to pay a ransom in order to free that person. So at that stage, most people, even though they're told not to inform the police, because what else do you do? And it's then up to the negotiator to actually act as a coach, to coach the victim communicator, as we call them. So the family member is the person that actually communicates with the hostage taker. So it's very important that the hostage taker doesn't know that the police are involved. So it's what we call covert negotiation. It's a completely different set of skills to overt negotiation, where you're actually speaking face to face with that person who is the hostage taker, or speaking on the phone. You've actually got to basically negotiate through a third party, and you've got to tell that person what to say without them giving the game away and making it clear that the police are actually there and they're listening. So that's a 1 week course, okay, and again, as you can imagine, quite intensive, but it talks you through a different set of skills that you would need in those type of scenarios. So if you've got an actual kidnap and extortion case, you wouldn't have someone who was regionally trained, for example, responding to that type of case. You would have to have a red negotiator dealing with that. Okay? So what do they do? This is an interesting question. I've put up here the FBI Crisis Negotiation Unit's motto, okay, and this is the motto that they stand by in everything that they do. and it's in Latin, okay, so Pax per colloquium. Does anyone want to have a guess at what that might translate to? Anyone do Latin at school? Yeah, any ideas? Go on. Peace through wisdom. That's pretty close. It's not bad, it's not far off. Anyone else want to have a go? Yep, pretty much bang on. Okay, so this translates to resolution through dialogue. Okay, so that's what it means. And essentially, that's what negotiators are doing. They are trying to resolve incidents through talking, communicating with the individual, rather than using force. Okay, rather than using a tactical option and going in all guns blazing. So negotiation is just one tactical option that is available to incident commanders. Okay, so there are lots of different ways that you could go about resolving different types of incidents, and negotiation is just one of those potential options within that toolbox that incident commanders can refer to. And I've put up here some excerpts from both the national level and regional level policy documents relating to the concept of negotiation and what negotiators are there to do. So the ACPO document, which is the guidance for incident commanders in using and deploying negotiators, says that they are useful in all of these different types of incidents. So suicide intervention, missing persons, political protest, people in crisis, which covers a whole gamut of things, supporting incident commanders in firearms operations, offences of kidnap and or extortion, criminal sieges, and terrorist hostage incidents. Okay, so this one here is probably the one that most people think about when you think about what negotiators do. Okay, you see what's portrayed on the TV, and it might be that, you know, the actual hostage-taking incident that we've been talking about, not necessarily a politically motivated one or a terrorist-motivated one, tends to be the one that most people think negotiators do, okay, on a day-in, day-out basis. And actually, the reality is quite different. Okay, negotiators can actually be used in all of these types of situations and more. Okay, so it shows you the diversity and the varied nature of the role that they actually do. And again, there's one from our local force, okay, so West Mercia Police. There's quite a nice excerpt here which says that it's recognised across the country as an invaluable option in the safe resolution of incidents ranging from domestic and criminal sieges to suicide intervention, kidnap and extortion, product contamination and terrorism. Okay, so you can see there that negotiators are used in a vast variety of different situations. Now, just to clarify that a bit more, I've put some information up here about my own research, which looked at, amongst other things, the categories of deployment that English negotiators were involved in. Okay, so I interviewed 15 negotiators from 9 different police forces across England and asked them about their experiences of negotiating and what type of incidents they were typically being called out to. And we actually came up with 12 different categories that they were quite commonly and quite frequently being called out to. And I could divide them quite nicely into 4 key categories. Okay, so you're looking at pre-planned crisis negotiation deployments. Okay, now most people probably don't think about this, but in instances where the police have a warrant, for example, for somebody's arrest, and it might be that that person is known to have firearms on their person or in their house. They have what's called a firearms marker on their record. It might be that this person is a potential risk and may get involved in a hostage-taking situation or a barricade situation if the police then go to try and arrest them. In high-profile warrants like that, they have to take a negotiator out with them. So that's not something that is spontaneous. It's not somebody phoning up and saying someone's been taken hostage or somebody's on a motorway bridge, for example, threatening to throw themselves off. That is, you know, booked in advance, that the negotiators will go out with the firearms operatives, with the authorised firearms officers, to actually facilitate the arrest of somebody who is wanted. Okay? So pre-planned crisis negotiation deployments. You've also got protest or demonstration liaison and management. Okay, now negotiators will also be involved in things like pre-organised EDL marches, okay, so English Defence League, for example, or other particular groups that want to do marches or want to demonstrate, for example. Negotiators will actually be involved at the planning stage to make sure that the other side basically adhere to certain rules of engagement. Okay, so you can march here, you can't go into that street. It needs to be between these times, for example, on this date. And it's to ensure that any types of protest or march doesn't get out of hand and become violent. Okay? So again, that's probably something that most people weren't aware that negotiators did. You've then got spontaneous deployments, okay, under the crisis negotiations section. And this is by far the most frequent deployment category, okay, out of any of them. And this involves going out to people who are normally in some sort of escalated personal, emotional or psychological crisis. So you've got people who are threatening to take their own lives. Okay, so you've got suicide intervention as one of the categories here. You've got mental health or substance abuse precipitated crisis. So you've got people who, again, may be threatening to harm themselves or may actually be threatening to take their own life, but it's related to some sort of mental health de-escalation. You've then got high-risk missing persons. Okay, so negotiators will often be asked to try and make contact with someone who is particularly considered to be vulnerable and is a missing person. It might be that that person is a young person who hasn't been in contact with their family for some time, and they want to try and check that that person is okay. You've then got criminals evading apprehension. Okay, so these are people who, again, might have warrants out for their arrest, but the negotiators have sort of stumbled across that. So it's somebody who doesn't want to be arrested, and they've then formed some sort of barricade or a siege scenario. The negotiators have to go out and try and get them to come down nicely, so that they don't have to go in with the tasers and the dogs and the guns and everything else. And then you've got, lastly, dwelling-based barricade. Okay, so this is a situation where I've put up there without victims. Okay, so this is somebody who is in some sort of crisis, who's then barricaded themselves into a certain property or a premises and is refusing to come out. Okay, unless they're threatening to either blow the place up or kill themselves in some way or other, or harm themselves in some way. Okay, so this category here is the most frequently deployed to category that we see. But you've also, of course, got these other sort of slightly more glamorous categories, I suppose, and this is where you've got the overt negotiation and the covert negotiation that I talked about earlier. So you do have instances of hostage taking in this country. Not very common, thank God, but we do see it. And you may have domestic sieges where it's a similar sort of situation to this one, but you've actually got someone else, normally a family member or family members, who are being prevented from leaving the premises as well. Okay, so you've got victims as well. And then the covert negotiations, you've got kidnapping and extortion, so I talked about that previously. You've got pseudo-kidnapping, which basically is a scenario where the police tend to call it bad on bad. Okay, and it's normally where two rival gangs have basically got into a situation where one gang has taken one of the other gang's personnel hostage or a family member hostage to try and pay off a drug debt or something along those lines. Okay, so it's bad on bad because both of the parties that are involved may not have the best criminal record, shall we say. Okay, these are people that are known to the police. Having said that, the police still have to treat it as one of these. Okay, but they have to be careful not to give away their tactics in this scenario, because the person who is the hostage in one situation might become the hostage taker in another. Okay, so that's a slightly complicated one. And then you've got extortion cases, okay, which don't involve a person necessarily being taken hostage or being used for sort of kidnap purposes, but it might be that someone has found some sort of potentially personally damaging information or footage about a person. Okay, so we see this in sextortion cases. People have engaged in sexual behaviour which has then been filmed on a webcam, and that person shouldn't have been engaging in that behaviour. That footage is then used to try and extort money out of them. So either you pay me £1 million, or I'm going to send this footage to every person in your Facebook group or every person on your social media sites, something like that, or to your family. Okay, if it's somebody who's engaging in behaviour that could, have an impact on their family situation, which does happen. Okay, so those are the 12 categories that negotiators have been involved in, okay, and are involved in fairly frequently. But like I said, these are the ones that the negotiators are dealing with most frequently on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so I've already talked through this. This basically just tells you that spontaneous crisis negotiation deployments are the most frequent that negotiators see, but they do also get involved in these pre-planned deployments where the role of the negotiator is to basically either facilitate an arrest, okay, so to provide tactical operational support, or to act sort of as a mediator in these type of protests or demonstrations. Okay, so this is a bit of a reality check, which I hope you're kind of getting the picture as we've been going through that last slide. Not a lot of what negotiators do on a day-to-day basis actually involves hostages, okay, which to me is really reassuring. Okay, I'm quite pleased to see that isn't the case, and that the majority of what negotiators do is dealing with people who are in escalated personal crisis. Okay, and that can be in a number of different permutations. Okay, there's no sort of set definition for what crisis is. It's basically an inability to cope with the situation that you're in, and the majority of what negotiators are doing is going out to people who are threatening to either harm themselves or to take their own life. And there's not a lot of research. Okay, now as it stands at the moment, I've put up here a couple of pieces of research that we can talk about, but up until now there hasn't been a centralised database for the recording of what negotiators actually do. Okay, we have 43 forces across the United Kingdom, and at the moment they all record their deployments in a different way, using a different form, a different mechanism, and there is absolutely no comparability. Okay, so we can't actually look at whether Devon and Cornwall police are dealing with different type of incidents or different numbers of incidents compared to the Met, for example. Right, at the moment we have no way of doing any sort of empirical research to compare that. So I say at the moment, luckily, okay, we are about to launch a centralised database. Okay, I say we because I've been lucky enough to be involved in setting up, in the consultancy role, in setting up this database, which hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, is going to go live in January 2018, and will basically mean that every single force that signs up to it, and we're hoping that they all do, including Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and England obviously, will be recording their deployments in the same way. And as you can imagine, as an academic, that's quite exciting for me, because that means that at some point we are actually going to be able to do some proper research and look at what negotiators do. Having said that, okay, up until now we haven't really had much to go on, but we piloted the new database that's going to be rolled out with a couple of forces over an 18-month period, and we can look at basic data from those two forces. Okay, so we can see something. That's this piece of work that I'm talking about. So this was again a piece of consultancy work that I did with Norfolk Police, and it involved Norfolk and Suffolk police negotiators' data being looked at. So we found that, again, the most frequent deployment category, okay, and they are using a very similar system to my 12 deployment categories that I've just talked you through. The most frequent category was suicide or self-harm intervention, okay? And that suicide threats were present in over half of the cases that they've dealt with, which just shows you that, you know, that is the bread and butter of what negotiators are doing in the UK. Similar data from Scotland, okay, so the Alexander paper, 2011, slightly outdated now, but that's the only other piece of data that we've actually got, suggests that 59% of the cases that were dealt with by Scottish negotiators over a 3-year period involved threat to subject life through deliberate self-harm. Okay, so again, that sort of reinforces what we've just been saying. Deployment incidents involving true hostages is very rare. Okay, and if we look at the data that we've got, roughly 6% of cases involve hostages. Okay, so again, Scottish data said 6% involved hostages. The data that we looked at from Norfolk and Suffolk, 6.6% involved hostages or victims, and only 4.8% actually involved red centre cases. Okay, so the cases where you're having to negotiate covertly through a third party. Okay, so it just shows you that, you know, what you see on the TV isn't a realistic picture of what negotiation is about, really. If we look at data from the States as well, we see a similar sort of picture. Okay, now, again, we have limited data. They do have a database, okay, which is a national database in the States called HOBAS, the Hostage and Barricade Database System. But the problem with that is that forces can kind of self-select as to whether they actually feed their data into that database or not. Okay, so it's dependent on whether people decide to feed it in. So again, they've got some data which is national, okay, and it's managed by the FBI, but it's not an accurate representation of all of the deployments, okay, because forces, like I say, departments can choose whether they want to submit their data or not. But the data that we have got suggests that 77% of cases between 1998 and 2006 involved suicidal individuals, okay, so that's an even higher statistic than we would be looking at with our data. And a slightly more recent survey by a colleague of mine, Andrew Young, in the States, in Texas, shows us that he found that 6.9% of call-outs involved hostage situations. So again, we're getting that 6% figure recurring here. 43.4% involved barricaded subject situations, and 7.5% involved suicidal subjects, or jumpers, as they tend to call them in the States. This figure here indicates suicidal or self-harm scenarios as well. Okay, so they categorise things slightly differently, but actually these type of barricaded subject situations will typically involve people who are threatening to harm themselves rather than necessarily threatening to harm somebody else, such as a hostage, for example, or a victim. Okay. So, just to kind of synopsise about that, there's a couple of excerpts up here that basically show you what I've just said, both from a UK perspective and from a USA perspective. So West Mercia Police, their negotiator policy says that not all types of incidents involve the taking of hostages, but all are life-threatening or display the potential for significant harm or damage to the community, a person or commercial enterprise. And then the quote below, which is quite a well-known one from Nosner and Webster, says the majority of critical incidents to which law enforcement responds involve subjects who are motivated primarily by emotional needs. These incidents may involve jilted lovers, disgruntled employees or students, mood disorder or psychotic subjects, suicidal individuals, or individuals who, for whatever reason, believe that they or their beliefs have been threatened or demeaned by society. So, you know, the takeaway point here is that most of these incidents involve people who are in some sort of crisis, rather than, you know, the glamorous hostage-taking ransom scenario that we tend to think of. Okay, just a note here about terminology. Okay, now hopefully you can see from what we've gone through so far that the negotiator role is pretty varied. Okay, they they don't know whether they're going to be called out to a hostage-taking situation one day, or whether it's going to be somebody on the edge of a motorway bridge, for example, who's threatening to harm themselves. They need to be prepared for all eventualities, okay, because they have no idea what they're going to come up against. But if we look at the data that we have got from these databases, it suggests that crisis negotiation is the bread and butter of what they're doing, and that you either need to be referring to crisis negotiation or to hostage and crisis negotiation. Okay, because if you look at the literature from sort of the early days, and we'll talk about how negotiation evolved in a minute, you'll see that most of the literature refers to hostage negotiation, but that simply isn't an accurate representation of what negotiators do. So in both the States and in the UK, negotiators are referred to as hostage and crisis negotiators, okay, to encompass all aspects of what they do. Okay, so this is what we tend to think of when we think of a hostage situation, but actually this is the reality, okay, particularly in the United Kingdom. So what we can see here is a chap who is on the other side of the railings on the top of a motorway bridge. Okay, you've got a uniformed police officer here and here. This is a paramedic, and this chap here, okay, with the big warm coat, is the negotiator. Now the reason I know he's the negotiator is firstly because he's wearing a big warm coat. He knows that he's in there for the long haul. Okay, negotiators will use time as a tactic. Okay, they can be there and talk and listen for as long as they need to. Okay, it's something that they are essentially trained to do. But the other reason that I know he's the negotiator is because he's not wearing uniform. Now, a negotiator, despite being a police officer, okay, they have to be a police officer, we've established that, will always try and distance themselves from the police. Okay, so they will always try and disassociate themselves from the police as much as they can, and they will always turn up in civilian clothing. They will never ever go out to a call out in uniform. Okay, now the reason for that is that sometimes that uniform can act as a barrier, and what you're trying to do as a negotiator is to develop a relationship with that person. And often, not always the case, but in some cases, the subject, okay, this guy here, may not have had the best experience with the police previously. Okay, so it may be that if somebody turns up in uniform and tries to talk to them, that's simply going to act as a barrier and block any form of kind of dialogue. So that's essentially why negotiators will always turn up in civilian clothing. Okay, so this is the realistic picture of what happens and what negotiators do. Okay, are there any questions before we move on to look at why? No? Okay, so I've got some questions for you then. And normally I will admit that when I get to this slide previously, I've normally answered this question for you. But I'm hoping that this time I haven't. Alright? So, does anyone want to make a suggestion as to why we use negotiation as a tactical option? As opposed to force. Okay, as opposed to what we call as the hard option. So going in with guns, for example, or tasers, or dogs, whatever else it might be. Go on.
Minimise harm.
Yep. Okay, so to minimise harm to who?
Everyone.
Yep. Every party involved, basically. Okay, good. Good suggestion. Go on.
It allows the person who we're trying to negotiate with to have control over what happens.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that they feel. Do you want them to feel in control?
Not necessarily. You give them. They're perceiving that they're in control.
Yeah.
Because you're not telling them do this, do that. You're just trying to persuade them out of it so they believe that it was their decision.
That they've got the choice in terms of what the outcome is. Yeah, that's good, and that is something that negotiators do. It's a fine art to make somebody believe that they're in control when actually all the time you are the one in control, and that's quite difficult to do. But that is a tactic that they use. Okay, good. Any other suggestions? Go on. I knew we were going to get the money one. That's an interesting one, and a lot of the time I do get, the suggestion that it's actually going to be cheaper to use negotiators. Actually, it isn't always. Okay, and the reason for that is that negotiators will always play the long game. They will always sit and talk for as long as they need to. They are not in any rush at all to solve the situation. That means that it can be more expensive sometimes, okay, and that's something that does cause conflict between the incident commander, who is someone who is thinking about budgets and how much it's costing potentially to close a motorway, and all of those type of things that might be involved in cordoning off an area. It causes conflict because the commander and the firearms commander, who's also often involved, they want to get the job done quickly. Bish bash bosh. Go in with the guns, go in with the tasers, get it sorted. But the negotiator, their ultimate aim is to take as long as it takes to resolve the situation without any injury to anyone, basically. So, yes, on the outset it might appear to be cheaper, but it isn't always. Okay, but I've just given you a little clue there that, the ultimate aim is to minimise harm, and particularly minimise loss of life, to any of the parties involved in the situation. Okay, it's a valid suggestion. Okay, so we've talked a bit about this really, in that there are two options that you can take when trying to resolve these type of situations. Okay, now if we think about, I'll try and give you an example. Think about the Sydney Lindt Cafe siege. Okay, that was a situation where they tried to negotiate, but they decided to go in with the tactical option anyway. Okay, they didn't feel that they were getting anywhere with the negotiation. And what happened as a result of that was that more people died through police gunfire than actually the hostage taker killing people. So that is one example as to why, if you can negotiate a situation, rather than going in trying to resolve it using force, you are better off because you are less likely to have casualties or injuries or fatalities. Okay? So that's basically why we do it. So, the primary aim of negotiation, as we said, is to minimise and eliminate the loss of life. Okay? But it also is to minimise harm or injury to all parties involved. So you've got to think about the fact that these type of situations often don't only involve two parties. Okay, it will typically involve other people, whether it's the wider community, bystanders, people in local flats or wherever it, around the vicinity of where the situation is happening. If it's on a motorway bridge, you might have people, going underneath, driving underneath, that type of thing. So you've got to think about trying to minimise any potential harm to all of the parties that might be involved. Okay, so typically, yes, you've got hostages, you've got the individual in crisis, you've got the hostage taker, who, most of the time you want to take them alive so that they can be punished for what they've done, rather than killing them, because to me that's the easy way out. So you actually want to resolve that situation without injury to them as well. And of course the negotiators, okay, you've got to think about the risk of harm to them as well. Okay, so another reason that we do it, and that we choose to negotiate, is because we know it works. Alright? We've got some empirical evidence, research evidence, that attests to the fact that it works, but we've also got negotiators who are doing this job day in, day out, telling us that this works. Okay, rather than going in with guns and everything else, we have negotiators who come back having resolved these type of situations successfully using dialogue. Okay, so that's partly why we do it. It's also become known as one of law enforcement's most effective tools, okay, which I would agree with. I think as long as people are trained appropriately and it's performed appropriately following guidelines, then it can be an incredibly effective tool and it saves lives. Okay, so that's essentially why we do it. We've got some data from the American database that suggests that 82% of reported incidents were resolved without death or injury to the perpetrator or the victim, which is a pretty good success rate. The data that I've got from the Norfolk and Suffolk research that I was talking about was higher than that. I think it was about 92.9%, something like that. So, you know, essentially negotiation on the outset works, okay, and that's why we do it. That's why negotiators are employed to do it as an additional role. So where does it come from? Okay, well, it's a fairly new discipline, okay, when we talk about sort of contemporary disciplines. It's been around since sort of the 1970s, 80s. There's a lot of disagreement as to who actually created the concept of negotiation. The NYPD are probably, you know, credited with having set up the first ever hostage and crisis negotiation team. So the New York Police Department, but again the FBI, you know, like to take credit for some of that as well, I think. But essentially it's fairly new. Okay, so prior to the 1970s at least, these type of incidents, if there was any hostage-taking incident, specifically, they would be dealt with using force. Okay, there was no question. There was no thought of actually trying to talk people out of that type of situation. If they had guns and weapons and were threatening people, you went in, with SWAT and you tried to take them out, basically, without injuring hostages. That was essentially the route that was taken. And I suppose the impetus for developing negotiation as an actual police tool comes from a number of very high profile, poorly managed incidents. Okay, so international incidents that resulted in a lot of deaths and, basically could have been managed more effectively. So the first one is the Attica prison riot. So Attica prison in New York, okay, 1971. I haven't got time to show you the clip today, but I've actually put a YouTube clip, which is part of a documentary where they talk about what happened at Attica on Blackboard. So I would strongly advise you to have a look at that. I think it's 8 minutes long, it's not particularly long, but it talks you through what happened in that situation. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And the second one is what they refer to colloquially as the Munich Massacre. Okay, so this was a hostage-taking situation that happened at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich in Germany, and again resulted in lots of deaths when they needn't have had that outcome. So the Attica prison riots basically happened as a result of prisoners feeling very oppressed and that their human rights were being neglected. Okay, so what happened was that a bunch of prisoners managed to sort of overtake one of the yards, okay, one of the outside yards, and managed to take 40 guards as hostages. Okay, so they managed to get hold of weapons, the guards' firearms, and they took them, a whole load of them hostage in the yard outside area. The kind of approach that they took was that they tried to negotiate. Okay, they used someone who was a human rights lawyer, a guy called William Kunstler, who came in and essentially tried to act as an advocate for the prisoners and to be a mediator between the state and the prisoners and try to resolve the situation. Now, this wasn't hostage negotiation as we know it. Okay, it was a slightly different approach to it. But it was a first attempt at trying to negotiate in this type of situation. And essentially what happened was that over a period of 5 days, they reached a bit of an impasse, and it didn't seem like they were going to resolve the situation. And the governor basically lost patience and said, I've had enough of this, I'm not having my prison being taken over like this, and approved military action, which was completely disproportionate to the scale of the actual incident. So I think there was 1,000 police officers, National Guard, so military members, who basically launched a full-scale assault on the prison. They went up onto the top of the prison walls and basically just started shooting people indiscriminately. Okay, they used tear gas, they used weapons and bullets that are outlawed by the Geneva Convention. And ended up pretty much killing everyone. Okay, so they killed 31 of the prisoners in doing that, but they also killed 9 of the guards as well. Okay, so they just decided they were going to shoot everyone. And like I say, that video clip is very sombering. Okay, obviously it does show some quite sort of sensitive images, but that is what happened. Okay, and this is 1971, so you know, thankfully things have changed somewhat, but this was how they chose to deal with it. Okay, so that was the first incident that sort of aroused people's concern about how the police particularly were dealing with these type of incidents. The second one was the Munich massacre. Okay, so this was a politically motivated terrorist incident whereby a group of terrorists who refer to themselves as Black September decided to take a number of athletes and I think their coach hostage at the Munich Olympics, okay, within the Olympic Village. And they were demanding the release of a large number of Palestinians and non-Arabs who were jailed in Israel. So there was 234 people that they said they wanted all of these individuals to be released, and that if they didn't do that, they were going to kill the hostages. Okay, now the Munich police obviously dealt with this incident, and there was no real negotiation. Okay, there was obviously communication between the hostage takers and the police, but there was no real negotiation. Essentially what happened was that once the Munich police said, you know, they were given this demand, they basically said, don't be ridiculous, we're not going to do that, we haven't got the power to do that anyway, and the dialogue then stops at that point, and the hostage takers then essentially said, well, we're going to start shooting people. The Munich police went in, all guns blazing, and most people died as a result of it. Okay, so all of the hostages, 5 of the actual terrorist group, and 1 policeman as well, died as a result of that action. Okay, so these were the 2 sort of high-profile incidents that led police around the world to start talking about the fact that we don't really have a method or a protocol for responding to these type of incidents, okay, that results in success, you know, and minimal harm to all the people involved. Okay, so the tragedies highlighted a lack of protocol to deal with these type of incidents, and international law enforcement started to develop new techniques to deal with these type of incidents. The police started implementing what they referred to as a negotiate first policy, okay, and this applies all throughout the Western world really, and definitely here, in that we will always try to negotiate first, okay, before going in tactically. Yes, you may have to resort to going in tactically and using force, but you would always try and negotiate first before doing that, okay, and since then, there's been a number of different models that have been developed to help guide negotiators in terms of what they should be doing, and we're going to be looking at some of those in the next lecture. And as I've said at the bottom there, most police forces or departments have trained negotiators, okay, at least 4 I would have thought in terms of a team, but most of them have many more than that. Okay. So, just to synopsise what we've been talking about in terms of why we negotiate, the tool of negotiation was developed in response to these poorly handled international incidents. We know that communication can be used, if it's used appropriately, to de-escalate these type of situations without the need for resorting to tactical intervention, okay, which may result in injury or loss of life. And we know from both anecdotal and empirical evidence that hostage and crisis negotiation actually works. Okay, as long as it's done appropriately by trained individuals, it tends to be effective. Okay, do people want to have a short break, or do you want me to carry on? I've got a few nodding heads. Should we have a bit of a break to let you kind of assimilate the information, and then you can come back. Okay, so just 5 minutes, guys. Try and be back in 5 minutes, if that's all right. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the concept of how now. Okay. Now, there are some key aspects that you need to be aware of in terms of how negotiators are actually deployed. So we'll look at that to begin with. So the National Negotiator Deployment Model, and this is UK, okay, just to clarify, this is what we do in the UK, is that there are 2 negotiators on call at any one point in time. Okay, and they will be that there's 2 negotiators who are on call at any one point in time, but there's also what they refer to as a negotiator coordinator on call at any one point in time as well. Okay, now negotiators are deployed in pairs. Okay, so the first one is referred to as the primary negotiator, and that is the person who basically does the speaking with the subject. Okay, that's the person who actually interacts directly with the subject, whether that's face to face or on the telephone, for example. The second person is the secondary negotiator, and that person is basically there to support and advise and to listen. Okay, so the secondary negotiator doesn't necessarily speak directly to the hostage taker or the individual in crisis, but they are there to support the primary. Okay, you can imagine as well that this is quite a stressful role to be performing, and that sometimes you might need to swap. Okay, so that in some instances, and it may not necessarily be as a result of stress, it might simply be that you've been communicating for a long time with that person and you need a comfort break. So you can't just say, I'm off now, I'm going to the loo. You obviously need to hand over to someone else who can take over that position, okay, take over the communication. So you've got your primary negotiator and your secondary negotiator. You've then got what I referred to earlier as the negotiator coordinator, and this is basically someone who is more highly trained. Okay, they've done a coordinator course, and they are there as the supervisor or the team leader. Okay, now they are basically overseeing what is happening with the negotiation, and they then liaise with the incident commander. Okay, so the incident commander is the person that is in control of the overall operation, the overall incident management. Okay, and you will have somebody who is on the scene, okay, and they are the on-scene incident commander, who's normally referred to as Silver. You have a tactical firearms commander, if appropriate. Okay, so it might be that you have firearms teams present if there's potential risk of firearms being present, or if you feel that there needs to be that tactical intervention, or there might be a need for tactical intervention. They are the bronze commander. And then you have the gold commander, who is the person who is basically the big boss, sat in the police station in his ivory tower, who actually has overall kind of power, as it were, over the entire situation. Okay, so the buck stops with the gold, but the silver is the one who's actually on scene. Okay, now the negotiator coordinator will liaise with the silver commander and will say to them, what do you want us to do? Okay, negotiators never make any decisions about what's going to happen and how the incident is going to be resolved. This person does. Okay, it's up to the silver commander, potentially in liaison with the bronze, if there's a bronze there. These are the two people that make the decisions, and they then feed their decision to the coordinator, the negotiator coordinator, who then feeds the decision to the negotiators. Okay, so it's a sort of feedback mechanism. And you can see that a little bit more clearly here. If we look at this as being the stronghold, okay, so this is where your hostage taker or where your subject, your individual in crisis is. You may have hostages or victims present, or you may not. You've then got the negotiating cell, okay, so you've got your team leader, so this is your negotiator coordinator. A full cell, so this is a picture depicting a full negotiator cell. So this would be, some sort of major hostage taking incident. For something that involves an individual in crisis, you would only have the 2 negotiators and the team leader, for example. But for a full-scale incident, you would have 4 negotiators working within that cell, as well as a team leader. This is your silver or your tactical firearms commander and your negotiator coordinator, and then you've got your gold, who is in overall strategic command of the whole incident. Okay, so this is essentially how it works and how the feedback mechanism works. If you're lucky, and unfortunately we're not here in the UK, but in the States, pretty much every negotiation team has an MOV, Mobile Operations Vehicle, which look a bit like this. And I've been lucky enough to go inside one of these and see the sort of equipment that they use. But in the States, they operate on a slightly different system, where they will try to avoid negotiating face-to-face at all costs. Okay, they don't like negotiating face-to-face. They will try to do everything they can via telephone. And that is for 2 reasons. Firstly, it can be recorded quite easily with a piece of equipment that I will show you in a minute. And secondly, there is much more risk in terms of firearms in the States, so they don't want to put themselves in a position where they could potentially be shot by a hostage taker, for example. Okay, so they try to do a lot of it via telephone. We, on the other hand, tend to prefer, as long as we're not putting ourselves at risk as a negotiator, they tend to prefer to do things face to face. Okay, and that's because it's a lot easier to develop a rapport with somebody if you're speaking to them face to face. You can see their body language, they can see your body language, you can use your tone of voice, and it's basically a much easier mechanism than trying to do it on the phone. Okay, but this is what the Americans have. They have these mobile command centres, which are pretty impressive pieces of kit, I have to say. This is the phone mechanism that I was talking about. They have a rescue phone, which is a crisis response telephone, and it's a big basically briefcase that they can carry around, and they have these within their MOVs, and you can basically plug in headsets which can be used to talk to people using this landline. Okay, now this is what they call a throw phone. It has a really, really long cable, and they can throw this phone quite literally into the stronghold. Okay, wherever the person is, the hostage taker is, and the hostages are, they can get that phone delivered into the stronghold. And then they say to the hostage taker, can you pick up the phone? Okay? That phone can only be communicated one way. Okay, they can only speak to the negotiators. They can then block any of their mobile phones, for example, to stop them from phoning other people or having communication from other people, so that you know the only dialogue that is happening is between the negotiators, the police, and the hostage taker. Okay, so this is a really interesting piece of equipment. Secretly hidden within these phones is also a microphone, so that even if the phone is down, they can actually hear what's going on inside the stronghold. So it's a tactical piece of kit as well. Okay, so they can hear what's actually going on. But essentially, it means that you can plug in recorders, dictaphones, make sure that you can actually record everything that's been said from both sides. And there's a button that you can press to talk, so it's a lot easier than having to hold a phone. They have those great Madonna headsets that they use, or the American footballers. You've seen the NFL headsets, that's what they use, and they have a button that they press to talk and not. So it just makes their life a lot easier. Unfortunately, we don't really have this type of equipment. There are some, but not every team or cadre of negotiators has access to this type of equipment, mainly because there isn't the demand for it, which again is a positive thing. Okay. So, I was going to ask for a volunteer from the audience, but if no one wants to volunteer, then we can do it without. So, it's completely up to you. Okay, we'll do it without. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. So, what I want you to do is imagine that you are the negotiator, okay, and you need to speak to this person here, who is the hostage taker. What would you say to him? Go on. There's no right or wrong answers. I'm not expecting you to be great negotiators at this point. Go on.
I'd ask what his demands are.
Yeah. Okay, so you want to know what he actually wants. That's a good one. You definitely want to know that. Is there something that you might do before that? Who said it? Somebody said it. Introduce yourself. Yeah. Okay, so part of what you're doing, okay, with this is trying to get to know this person, okay, and to develop what we refer to as a rapport. Okay, a lot of you will have done stuff relating to counselling psychology, counselling techniques. The development of rapport between two people is really, really important in this instance. So it helps to introduce yourself. Okay, now one of the tips that they would say to you is that we would never introduce ourselves as a police officer. What they would do is say, hello, my name is Amy, I'm here to help you and I'm with the police. Okay, or I'm with the police and I'm here to help you. So what they will say is it's not strictly a lie, okay, but it's not highlighting the fact that they are a police officer. Okay? And they won't use rank. Rank is sort of goes out the window when you're thinking about negotiation. Okay, so they would never say, I'm Sergeant blah blah blah. They would just say, my name's Peter or my name's Amy or whatever it might be, and I'm here to help you. Okay? So this person go on.
A daft question, but what happens if the guy decides he just doesn't like you?
Which is often something that happens. Okay, now if that does happen and you would try for a certain period of time to develop a relationship with that person, but sometimes because of a number of different reasons, may just be a personality clash, that is never going to happen. So as the negotiator, and particularly the secondary negotiator, part of their role is to try and monitor whether progress is being made. And if it's not, you have to say, swap out. Okay, and you're lucky if you've got somebody there to do that. In some cases, you'll be the first person on the scene. You can't leave that person there, you know, who may be about to jump off a motorway bridge. You have to start speaking to them. So, you know, sometimes it may be that there isn't an option for you to swap the negotiator. But most of the time, if it's something that has gone, you know, is a protracted incident, there'll be more than one of you there, and you make that judgment about swapping out and trying somebody else. But that's really important. It's about, part of it is about matching the negotiator to the hostage taker or the subject. That's really, really important. That's something that's come out of my own research with negotiators. That you need to be able to match those two parties, and that relates to a number of different things: gender, personality, background. You know, as much as you can. Okay, so you want this person. Believe it or not, you want them to be your friend, okay, or you want to be their friend. Rather than thinking about it in this context, this person is not your enemy. Okay, it might seem like they are on the outset, but your role, essentially, in the first point, is to get that person to like you. Okay, get that person to be your friend. The more you build that relationship, the more likely you are, as the negotiator, to be able to influence or manipulate that person into doing what you want them to do. And that's what it's about. That's, you know, in a nutshell, that's what you do in negotiation. Okay? Any other suggestions about what you might say to this person? Go on.
Any harm at all?
Any harm? Yes, yeah. You want to know how they're doing. Yeah. Okay, and particularly when it comes to long sieges or long protracted incidents, you want to make sure that that person is still functioning enough to be able to stay in control of what they're doing. Okay, because people get tired, they then start to do things that they wouldn't necessarily do if they weren't tired. Okay, so yeah, you want to see how they're doing. You want to ask them how they're doing. You want to ask them what's going on for them today. You know, you want to know about what they are going through at that point. Okay, and this applies to both hostage and crisis negotiation. There aren't two different models that you adopt. for different types of scenario. The same rules, the same protocols, essentially, with a few minor adaptations, apply to both sets of scenarios. Okay, any other suggestions? Okay. So, believe it or not, like I said to you, the emphasis really is on making that person your friend, okay, on the hostage taker or the individual in crisis being a friend. The more comfortable they feel with you, the more they trust you, okay. It's not necessarily only about being liked. They might not necessarily like you, but they might trust you and start to develop a rapport with you, which means that they're more likely to disclose information. Okay, and you know, part of what you're doing as a negotiator is to find out why they are in the situation they are in at that point in time. What is it that has led them to a point in their life where they have either had to take somebody hostage, or they're at a point where they feel like they want to end their life. Okay, so you want to know as much as you can about that person. And you know, the idea behind that, and I've referred to this as a quasi-therapeutic alliance, in that that's essentially what you are doing as a negotiator. You're not trained as a counsellor, you're not a psychologist, which is why it's a quasi-therapeutic relationship, but that's what you are trying to do. You are trying to develop a relationship with that person which leads to them trusting you, disclosing information, which you can then use to influence their behaviour in a positive manner. And that's what negotiation is all about. Okay, some basic principles. It's not rocket science. Okay, negotiation isn't particularly complex. Okay, yes, it can be a stressful setting, it can be a stressful sort of role to be doing, but at the end of the day, negotiators will say to you that all you're doing is communicating with people. Okay, so the first thing is that you communicate with them. Okay, it's just talking, essentially. You want to know about that person. The second thing, which is even more important than the first, is that you need to listen to that person. Okay, so in order to establish what has brought them to this point in their life, you need to listen to them. Okay, so active listening is something that, you know, is taught very, very heavily on all of those courses that I mentioned at the beginning, all of the training courses. One of the key focuses is on how you can actively listen. Okay? And negotiators will say to you that you've got one mouth and two ears, and that you should use them in the proportions in which they were given. So you should always use your ears, you should always listen more than you should talk. Okay? Go on.
What happens if the person doesn't speak over English? If we have people that specialise in language?
Negotiating through a third party, i.e. a translator, is very, very difficult, but it's something that we often have to do. So there are people that the police can call upon who are sort of registered translators that they will use to come in and actually be the third party to mediate between the two. But it makes it very complicated, okay, because you can relay something and you can use a certain intonation, but it might be that that intonation isn't then relayed by the translator, for example, so you lose, the message can be diluted in doing that, but it is something that they have to do. Yeah. Okay. Next one is to identify hooks and triggers. Okay, now hooks are normally positive things, concepts, people, that you will like to focus on as a negotiator. Okay, so these are things that normally act as de-escalators. Okay, they are things that when you're talking about them, they tend to calm you down. Okay, so for some people, it might be that a particular hook for them is their pet dog. Okay, so you find out about what their pet dog is called, and you talk about that dog to them. Okay, for another person, it might be that cricket is their favourite pastime, or Manchester United is their favourite football team. And it's something that is almost innocuous, okay? It's not related to the situation they're in. It's not related to trying to get them to come out or come down. It literally is a way of almost passing the time in a benign way and getting them to de-escalate arousal levels, okay? So it's trying, as a negotiator, what you've got to try and do is you've got to try and find or pick up on those hooks. For some people, it might be that their wife is a hook, okay? For others, it might be, and you've got to base this on the situation, it might be that the wife is actually a trigger, okay? So the opposite. So if you're dealing with someone who is suicidal because they've just found out that their wife is having an affair with their best friend, two particular triggers might be the wife and the best friend, okay? That you may not want to talk about that initially, okay? So you've got to try and establish through disclosure, through dialogue with that person, what the hooks are and what the triggers are. And then you focus on the hooks and avoid the triggers. Okay? Establish what they want or what their demands are. Okay, so if this is a hostage-taking situation, they're likely to have demands of some sort. If it's an individual in crisis, they are likely to be trying to achieve something as a result of it. Okay? It may not be that they particularly or necessarily want to take their life. It might be that they need some intervention, they need some support and they're not getting it, and that this is their only way of getting that message across, for example. So you've got to try and establish what it is that they actually want, what they're trying to achieve. Build a relationship or a rapport, okay, and trust by demonstrating empathy. Okay, so that's one surefire way of trying to build that rapport with somebody, and actively listening. Okay, so listening is one thing, but actively listening is where you demonstrate to the other person that you are, one, hearing what they're saying, and two, you're understanding what they're saying. Okay, so active listening varies from things that we call minimal encouragers, which might be saying uh-huh and nodding your head, to reflecting back what that person has said to you. So you've just told me this, am I getting it right that this is how you're feeling about this situation? And you're basically reflecting back and paraphrasing what that person has said to you. And there's a whole range of different active listening tools that you can use. Generate options and encourage problem solving. Okay, now for people who are in crisis or conflict situations, okay, it becomes very difficult to see any other way out than the one that is staring you in the face. So for someone who has taken somebody hostage, it is probably very difficult for them to see that anything good can come of it. You know, they will be thinking, I've either got to kill the hostage, or I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to be killed by the police. Okay, but as the negotiator, what you've got to do is show them that actually there is another way that it can end, and that things can be resolved. Okay, and you're encouraging problem solving. You're not doing problem solving. You're not trying to solve this person's problems, because you probably can't. Okay, and you're not, as a negotiator, as a police officer, you're not equipped to do that anyway. But you're encouraging them to think through potential solutions to their problem. Okay. And then lastly, I said to you that the ultimate aim is essentially to influence that person's behaviour in a positive manner. Okay, so you're trying to facilitate behavioural change, and as a negotiator, what you are essentially is a professional persuader. Okay, and they are very good. These people are very good at persuading people to do what they want them to do, and not what they think they want to do. Okay, so those are some of the basic principles. Okay, there is a lot more to it, obviously, but that's the starting point. Those are some of the key principles that negotiators are taught when they're starting out. So it is a complex situation, okay, and we know that that the number of variables that exist in any crisis or conflict situation is infinite. Okay, you're never going to go out to exactly the same situation with exactly the same subject, for example, And you've got to be prepared to be able to deal with any situation that arises. Okay? So it's referred to by some as a complex verbal dance between the negotiator and the subject. And you've got to be prepared for this spectrum of infinite situational variables to change over time. Okay, so some subjects are suicidal, some are homicidal, some are both. Some will involve weapons or explosives, some won't, and some will involve barricaded situations or sieges, and others won't. So no two situations are ever going to be the same. So it's unrealistic, really, to think that we can give negotiators a set blueprint, for example, for every single situation that they might encounter. What we've got to do instead is give them a working model, a flexible model that they can apply regardless of whatever the situation is. Okay? So the idea is that these models of negotiation, which we will talk through in much more detail next time, need to be able to be flexible and applied to any situation that they might encounter. Having said that, okay, there is a set of instructions almost, or a protocol that has been developed in terms of how the police need to respond to any type of situation like this. Okay, and that's what we're going to finish off by going through. And it's referred to as the basic consensual protocol. Okay. Okay, so this was developed in the States, but applies to the UK as well. And it basically talks you through a number of steps that need to be performed, both by the critical incident management team, as it were, okay, so both by police officers and by negotiators. So that has relevance, without giving too much away, that has relevance to your case study. Okay, and that's the only hint I'm going to give you. So first of all, you've got this scenario that's unfolding, okay, whether it's a hostage-taking situation, and you need to make sure that you isolate and contain the hostage-taker and secure the perimeter. So one of the key things with negotiation is that you need to make sure that the area is sterile. Okay, and by sterile, what we mean is that unauthorised persons can't get in, for example, to the stronghold, and the hostage taker can't get out. So it's basically a secure area that you are the only link between the hostage taker or the stronghold and the outside. Okay, as the negotiator, you are that link. Alright? So you need to set up cordons, for example. You need to evacuate people from the local area if they are potentially at risk. So if you're dealing with a barricade situation in a block of flats, for example, it might be that you need to evacuate the whole block of flats. Okay, if there's a potential risk of somebody using a gas explosion to blow themselves up or blow people up, which does happen. So you need to make sure that the area is contained. Okay. The second one is to provide the scene control. Okay, so again, you're looking at the concept of mobilising medical services. Okay, so in that previous picture I showed you with the guy on the motorway bridge, there was a paramedic there and an ambulance there. So you need to make sure that there are medical personnel available in case things do go wrong, in case somebody does get injured or does harm themselves. Okay? You need to control the local traffic. Okay, so when we were talking about the motorway bridge example, you would need to stop that motorway traffic to ensure that there aren't people driving underneath, okay, because you don't necessarily want that person jumping and falling onto someone's car, causing an accident, causing more deaths, for example. Okay, so if that person does decide to take their own life, they are going to be the only one that is a casualty as a result of that. Okay, dealing with the media. Okay, this is another interesting one, and this is okay. I'm going to give you two hints. This is also another hint, but this is the last one. You need to think about media helicopters, for example, which can be very problematic, and who can actually see the information that's being screened or shown from a media helicopter, for example. So in these type of incidents, depending on how large scale they are, larger scale incidents, you're always going to have plenty of media there. You're going to have newspapers reporting, you're going to have news channels reporting, and there is an agreement within certain countries, at least within the UK, that the media can't broadcast footage without having a delay, a time delay on it. And I think I'm right in saying that it's 3 minutes in the UK. Okay, so there will be certain embargoes where the police have the right to basically say you can't broadcast this information because it could help the hostage taker, for example, which was relevant to the case study. But in some countries they don't have that type of authorisation. So a media helicopter, for example, a news channel could be broadcasting what's going on, i.e. the police preparing for a tactical assault, and if there's a TV present where the hostage taker is or where the stronghold is, then they can actually see what's happening and that the police are actually about to launch an assault, which gives them time to kill people, kill hostages, try and escape, all those type of things. Okay, so controlling the media is really, really important. And keeping the surrounding community informed to protect their safety. So again, thinking about evacuating people from the local area, making sure that cordons are tight enough to prevent anyone from getting in, that there are enough uniformed officers manning the cordon to make sure that people can't get through. Essentially, you want to avoid any third-party intervention or interaction, particularly in cases of crisis negotiation where you've got individuals in crisis. You would probably be surprised to hear that you do get people, bystanders, walking past and heckling. If you've got people on the top of a tall building shouting jump, things like that, which to me is horrific, but it happens. Okay, I've spoken to plenty of negotiators who've had that experience themselves. So you don't want the public or bystanders to be able to do that, to interfere with the negotiation. You want it to be a sterile environment, and you want the hostage taker or the subject to only be focusing on you. Okay? You want their 100% attention. You don't want them hearing from anyone else, because it can actually derail a negotiation. Next one. So this is where once you've set up your cordon, you've got your sterile environment, you need to establish some sort of communication with the subject. Okay? And you can choose a variety of different methods to do that. And when we look at the diamond model, which I'll be talking about in much more detail, you'll see that will depend on the most appropriate method for that situation and for that person. If you're negotiating with a young person, for example, who's a missing person, it might be that that person responds very well to text message or to Facebook chat, for example, and that's what you use as a negotiator, rather than trying to speak to them on the phone. So you've got to choose the most appropriate method. And you want to do that as soon as possible. And it's really important to not leave people hanging, because crisis can escalate in that situation. 4, you want to employ what is broadly called socialised communication strategies. Okay, so these are the techniques that I talked about in terms of rapport building and active listening. And you're trying to develop that therapeutic alliance with that person. 5, okay, you need to respond appropriately to demands and deadlines, okay, with the overriding goal being the safety of the hostages. And when you're talking about hostage-taking situations, it might be that you can't meet a particular deadline because it's not realistic. But what you do in that instance is you talk through that deadline. So you make sure you are on the phone to that person while the deadline is approaching to try and distract them, essentially, so that they're not looking at their watch and going, you haven't met my deadline. Okay? So there are certain techniques that you can use when it comes to demands and deadlines. 6, you need to, this is on the basis that you've hopefully dealt with the situation. There's a bit of a jump here, but this is how it's structured. you've dealt with the situation, you need to make sure that you actually plan what they refer to as a surrender ritual. Okay, now until somebody has actually come out of a building or wherever it is that they might be, or come down from a motorway bridge or tall building, wherever they were situated, and are safely in police custody, there is always a risk that people can still get harmed, okay, or injured or killed. So you need to structure what they call a surrender ritual, which basically means you agree with the subject how they are going to come out of that situation. And it will be plotted, you know, in terms of the first thing you need to do is to put down the gun and kick it away from you, for example. The next thing you need to do is to send the hostage out. Once the hostage has come out, you can then come out of the building, but I want you to come out with your hands behind your head. I want you then to lie on the ground, put your hands behind your back. Someone will then come and handcuff you. So it's literally detailing every point that they need to follow in order to safely exit the situation. Okay? And then you've also always got to be aware that even up until that point where that person is safely in custody or safely out of the crisis situation, it could go wrong. So even, you know, at the last stage, somebody comes out but they've still got a gun in their hand, they can quite easily shoot you. So it might be that even at that latter stage, you need to say, right, we need to go tactical, and that's when firearms get involved. Okay, so you can't always assume that just because somebody has said they're going to come out peacefully and they're not going to harm anyone, that they will necessarily follow through with that. Okay, so you need to know when to employ a tactical response if necessary. And then lastly, you need to think about operational debriefing. Okay, now all of these things that we've been talking about are going to be incredibly stressful for most parties involved. Okay, hostages definitely. Okay, so you've heard of things like Stockholm syndrome. Okay, there are lots of psychological effects of being a hostage that can be quite damaging. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, is something that can be experienced, but equally police officers and negotiators can also suffer from psychological trauma as well, particularly if something hasn't gone very well, if there's been a negative outcome. So you've got to think about employing operational debriefing techniques which can reduce the likelihood of anyone experiencing trauma afterwards. Okay? So that is a very sort of broad, macro level approach of what you do in terms of managing these type of situations. Like I said to you, we're going to be looking at more specific models. Okay, and we're going to be looking at my own model, and that's where the diamond comes from. So this is the model that I've developed as a result of my own doctoral research, and basically tells us what negotiators in the UK do. Okay, so up until now, nobody's actually looked at that. We know what they do in the States, okay, and it's been researched to death pretty much in the States, but nobody's actually thought about what do negotiators in England do, and so that's where this model comes from. So, to summarise, just to bring it all together, negotiators are obviously police officers who are trained to respond to hostage or crisis incidents. We know that they are deployed to a variety of different situations, okay, so it's not just hostage taking scenarios. Most of what they do, it doesn't involve a hostage at all. We know it's utilised because it works as a police tool, essentially, and it minimises the risk of injury or harm and fatalities. And there are obviously a variety of different strategies and styles of negotiation that can be adapted. We're going to look at those more when we have the lecture in 2 weeks' time. You've also got a lecture next week, okay, from Lewis Provart, who is a Chief Inspector from Norfolk Constabulary that I've worked quite closely with. He's very experienced, he's very, very experienced as a negotiator, and he will be talking to you about his work and the type of cases that he's been involved with, and hopefully you'll be able to make some of the links between what I've been saying from an academic perspective and a research perspective and what he does on a daily basis as an operational negotiator. I have got some directed study for you. Okay, there's a couple of papers that I would like you to read Not necessarily by next week, but by the next lecture that you have with me, I want you to make sure that you've actually read these papers. They are available on Blackboard, okay, so if you click on the resource list, you should be able to just get hold of them. I have checked, and they are there. There's some key references up there as well if anyone wants to do any further reading. There's plenty of resources available on Blackboard that are relevant to your case study as well, so I'd say the more reading you do around this topic area, the better it will be for you. And if there are any questions, please feel free to come down and direct them to me. And otherwise, I'll be seeing you next week. Thank you.